Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken. I'm here with Paul as always. And Paul, there's an interesting thing. Obviously, we want to talk more about tariffs here in the future. But the big thing that was going on yesterday, especially in the US, is in regards to this institution known as USAID. Now, USAID goes back to an executive order that JFK put in about 1963 in regards to what was going on in the Cold War. And sadly, it has morphed itself into being pretty much the unaccountable uh, pool of money that has fomented so many different things in regards to foreign policy, regime change, et cetera, that I think it's definitely something we need to look at, especially after it was tackled so hard by Elon Musk as Doge and with Trump moving it into the State Department. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And what are your initial thoughts regarding this?
Well, obviously, thanks likewise for joining today, Ken. Yeah, it is important because actually USAID was established, Ken, apparently in 1961, and you're right, it was JFK. It currently has, I mean, this is an estimate, 10,000 or so employees, and it has a budget really of about $40 billion, which is about two-thirds of the total in US government foreign aid spending. Now, Trump's right to say we have to do something. It's not just even just part of doge and cutting government spending. It's absolutely right. It's completely out of control. And they put a 90-day embargo on everything, saying we're cutting all spending and we're going to review where all this money's been spent, where it's absolutely ludicrous and it needs to be cut. And of course, there's a lot of people who have been financially benefiting from USAID who are furious about this, going, we do all great work, and this is causing total chaos because Trump's literally decapitated the agency, which is true. Oh, we're all about humanitarian aid, and which is clearly highly debatable, to put it diplomatically. I mean, and obviously Musk came out and made comments the agency was planning to shut USAID down. Well, it is being merged into the State Department. So, on that basis, Rubio now effectively is the acting head of USAID. I would suspect someone within the State Department will be given that job. I can't, it's no disrespect to Rubio, but trying to manage that and do his day to day job, forget it, it's impossible. So, but it will be bought under the control of the State Department. I mean, and because it needs to be certainly reined in terms of the spending, where the money's being spent, how it's being spent, and we'll come on to that shortly. But I think Trump made some quite sort of inflammatory remarks, which he would do, saying the agency was run by radical left lunatics, was getting away with tremendous fraud, and didn't name names, and he shouldn't do because he could end up being hot water himself in doing so. But there's no doubt money has been spent in probably illegal ways, unconstitutional ways. It could harm national security. It could also seriously damage relations internationally. The United States already has a lot of issues in regards to its influence on the world stage, and there's no doubt something has to be done. And I think probably I'll stop there, Ken, and then we can start to discuss, in more detail, the kind of things that could be attributed to USAID and where it may have been involved in the past and where it could potentially evolve to in the future.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that in just a few days of being able to look over the finances and the paper trail, the number of different uses that have been detrimental not just to America in its foreign policy, but to many nations around the world is just staggering. These are three just off the top of the list. One, it appears that money was funneled, probably from NIH, to the gain of function group that it wasn't supposed to happen. It was done through USAID, which has direct ties to the pandemic and the Wuhan lab. We also have where USAID was how Victoria Nuland sent money to foment the Maidan coup back in 2014. Then, of course, we have in Syria, USAID was sending money, and they were the ones who were funding the White Helmet group that made all these spurious claims about chemical warfare to try to bring down the Assad regime. That's just three that they found in a very short amount of time. So imagine since the 1960s how much USAID has been used in things like regime changes, color revolutions, funding NGOs, all types of different uses for the U.S. government to be able to, or at least the agencies, to be able to do foreign policy that is not in an official capacity, but for their own, as they say, deep state means. So this is why it's vastly important. And while it still may be used for these type of covert efforts in the future under the State Department, at least now, for the first time in decades, there's some accountability that's going to be tied to it.
Yeah, and that's a really critical point you make, because it's absolutely clear, and we've talked about this many times over the years, is we can sit there and debate who's responsible for color revolutions, who's been responsible, specifically responsible, who's responsible for regime change attempts, who's toppling governments, etc., and all the things that have gone on historically. It's very easy to sit there and blame the president of a country who may actually have no idea what's going on, because everything is so compartmentalized. There's so many different entities potentially in play who could be responsible. It's very difficult to actually pinpoint specifically who is, because of how funding mechanisms can be put in place, and therefore money can be distributed in ways that are very difficult to know precisely who's got their hand in the till, so to speak, and who's distributing money to who. Now, the argument should be, and we say should because it might not be, is if you put it in the hands of the State Department, this might rule out certain nefarious entities inside the US using and abusing USAID for whatever nefarious programs they have in mind. I think the only thing I would counter this with is, because Rubio, to be fair, actually made a lot of interesting points. I've been pleasantly surprised in some capacity already, some of the comments he's come out with. But he basically has said, obviously, I'm notionally in charge of this for now. He called USAID unresponsive, which they have been. There's been requests for all manner of information, and nobody's provided anything. So clearly, some entities are trying to hide misappropriation of funds, whoever that is. And we're not naming names because we don't know. But he did say that a lot of the functions of the organization are going to continue. They're going to be part of American foreign policy, but it has to be aligned with what the policy decisions of the Trump administration is and the US State Department. Now, my concern with that is, and I'm saying it might be a problem, it doesn't mean the US is just deciding that it's going to give up on any nefarious activity. It's not going to finance color revolutions in different countries again. Because that would be, I think, very naive to say that. So it doesn't mean in the future that USAID couldn't do precisely what it is doing. But it's less likely to be a policy decision by rogue entities. And it could be in the intelligence agencies. They're not going to have the same control, or arguably over the purse strings and where money's spent or misappropriated. And that potentially is a major game changer. So, in principle, we should be very pleased about this. The only thing is, of course, there are going to be some legitimate USAID agencies who are trying to do good work around the world now, who suddenly had their funding cut off, and that means people in areas where they are doing genuinely good humanitarian missions will stop being able to function, and that's going to affect the lives of people. Okay, there's a separate question: is the United States responsible for that, and should the US be the one funding tens of billions of dollars a year? I'm with them on that. I agree with that, but it doesn't mean there aren't situations in the world which require that kind of assistance, and they shouldn't be stopped. Maybe the world needs to look after collectively these problems, and not the US spending all the money. So definitely there needs to be a cut in terms of what the US is spending, but where they're spending it, and try to, in essence, stop meddling in other countries. Hopefully, well, this is a new dawn, but let's not get carried away and pretend the Trump administration won't be involved in some future nefarious activities, which it regards as a matter of national security. Whether we agree or disagree is not the point. The point is, if they think it's the case, then they will do so, and maybe they will be involved in color revolutions in the future. It's entirely possible it could happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it will, but hopefully this is not only a huge cost-saving exercise, but it will also improve the United States' standing in the world, where countries will now regard them as being more trustworthy. But trust is going to take a long time for the US to regain that, because it's obliterated trust with most of the world, particularly the global South countries, because of decades of exactly this policy decisions. But the question now is, what does this do for the Pentagon? What does this do for the intelligence agencies and the crossover between the two? What does this potentially mean for the military industrial complex? Because they are undoubtedly, I think, throwing a spanner in those works in quite a marked way. It doesn't mean they're going to be entirely cut off from making decisions, but if the State Department does its job properly, and Rubio does do his job properly, and we have to hope he does, then this could potentially, and I stress potentially, be a very profound change in US foreign policy, who's carrying it out, when it's being carried out, and why it's being carried out. And we have to hopefully look forward in the future to seeing that. There's no doubt this has surprised a lot of people. And will surprise people. It's also shocked people. It's angered people, because there are going to be NGOs out there who will be decapitated. So their gravy train and their big paydays will come to an end. It will also leave a lot of existing nefarious activities will now be in the lurch, because if people don't get paid, they're not going to do their job. They'll go, well, I'll go somewhere else, because, Trump might do a 90-day review, but it doesn't mean they're going to start all these programs up again. It's just, let's just hope they don't start some of the programs up again that shouldn't be running, because, in inverted commas, it suits US foreign policy initiatives, which should never have any gravity in the first place.
When it comes to, obviously we're going to praise President Trump when he does things that are sound and beneficial, just as we're going to criticize when we see things as being inane or bombastic, hyperbolic, etc. I think, though, when it comes to USAID, it is one of the most important areas of the deep state, probably the perfect place if you want to break up the bureaucracy of the establishment that works against not only the government, but also the American people. USAID is the absolute first place to go. Now, a lot of the scuttlebutt is, well, it's only like 1% of the budget, and it's not really going to mean anything with cutting the deficit. In the long run, there are probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of NGOs over the course of the last 6, 7 decades that have sprung up and created that have ties to USAID, that have done covert activities around the world, unaccountable to governments, to agencies, to anybody because of this. You're also going to see potentially nations that have dealt with the State Department when it comes to foreign aid and foreign policy. Now they at least have a central place to go if they want to discuss or talk their grievances, etc. When you had a rogue agency like USAID that was being tapped into by tens of thousands of different institutions in some capacity, who do you go to for accountability? How do you stop it? You can't. And that's why for the deep state, it was the perfect vehicle to be able to do whatever they wanted, and nobody could ever chase down who was the instigator of it. Now, with that being said, you made the great point. Marco Rubio has long been, at least in his time in the Senate, more on the side of the neoconservatives, neoliberals, more warmonger. He got confirmed for the Secretary of State unanimously by Congress. So all the Democrats did. So, I was always leery about, well, when your enemy, alleged enemy, is giving you the thumbs up, then are you a poison pill in the system? But in the short amount of time that he's been Secretary of State, it's almost seemed, at least on the public side, we have seen where he actually wants to, it's almost like he's manifest and morphed into something where now he has the capacity to do some right things, as well as see the world the way it is, not the narrative of what the hegemonic US wants to do. And we're going to talk about that in a future podcast, on his recognition that the multipolar world is real and legitimate, and the unipolar world itself is dying. So that being set aside, I think the USAID, at least revealing it to everybody, that's the first step. Cutting the funding from it. I mean, you probably saw yesterday a ton, several different Democrats, senators and congressmen were out there trying to, appeal to the American people. That, oh my God, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. This is how we save the world, and yada yada yada. Well, the fact of the matter is that USAID, through these different connections that they were pumping money to, were kicking it back to many of these Congress individuals, and that was already proven in what Elon Musk found in his investigation of the paper trails. So this is shaking and rattling a lot of things. It's going to have an effect on foreign policy as well as legislation, because now there's going to be something held over the heads of many members of Congress. It's also going to affect future elections, because a lot of the money, we found out, was being used to pay off the media on many different topics that weren't discussed, whether it was going after Trump, whether it was Russiagate, whether it was this and the other. So it was funding so many different things that were harmful to not just the rest of the world, but to the American people itself, that it can only be for the better. Because the fact of the matter is that every nation in the world, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, whomever, they all have these agencies that are going to be looking out, doing covert activities for the benefit of their own country, even if it isn't considered something that's non-taboo by the rest of the world. That's just the way the world is. But if you now have accountability under a known entity, i.e. the State Department, at least in the future, nations can come together and discuss their problems with going on, rather than try to figure out, hey, why is all of a sudden 100,000 people protesting in the nation of Georgia, and we have no idea where the funding and the leadership to do this came from.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a few final points to make, Ken. Firstly, Rubio. Yeah, I've been one of his biggest critics for years, but I'm being pleasantly surprised. I'm not, but I don't get carried away. I'm not naive. And, Rome's not built in a day, so we'll see what happens. But he's made some quite intelligent remarks. I've seen a different Rubio than I used to seeing, but that remains to be seen if he carries on doing that. The other point with regards to accountability is one thing going out there and saying, well, this money's a complete waste. It's achieving no objective. It might be perfectly legitimate. Then you just shut it down, and then people get made redundant. They can come back to the United States, whatever they're being employed by, and then that's a cost saving. Then you get into areas where something might need to be streamlined, and therefore you're going to slash the budget by 60%, say. And on that basis, then it becomes a worthwhile pursuit in terms of what might be termed US foreign policy. Then you come on to the really important aspects to this is all the nefarious stuff that is hemorrhaging huge amounts of money that is in no one's interest, that have to be terminated. The question is, are individuals associated with this, whoever they are, going to be held accountable in law, if that's applicable, or whatever you might deem to be held accountable? Because ultimately, if someone's prepared to do it, and that could be dangerous, of course, because of the nature of who might be involved. But if they can do that, it will massively restore the US's credibility on the world stage. If the US starts to hold its hand up and admits responsibility for things, rather than sometimes admitting responsibility and laughing it off like, well, who cares? We're the hegemonic power, so it really doesn't matter if we do these things because we're the exceptional nation. We have the exorbitant privilege to do precisely what we want, when we want, how we want, sorry. So that is a big question, and we hope that comes about, because this could be a major positive stride forward in terms of its international relations, because there's no doubt the Chinese and the Russians have had huge experience of US NGOs trying to meddle inside the country. I mean, look at Hong Kong. Clearly, that was NGOs. Whether it's related to USAID, I don't know. It's impossible to say, but China had experience of that to do with Hong Kong. They've had meddling inside their country. Russia's the same. There's just two examples, and you mentioned Georgia. There was the coup attempt in Kazakhstan, Belarus, Venezuela. The list goes on. Maybe USAID's responsible for that. But equally, we have to be careful, because these might have been funded by some other so-called black budget somewhere else in the CIA, that then no one has any accountability as to where that money's spent equally. So it doesn't necessarily mean everything that's nefarious is associated with USAID, but I think it's an important step. And yes, it's as much as anything cost saving, but if it opens up a whole can of worms, let's hope the can of worms is dealt with and not swept under the carpet, because then that's just then become a cost-saving exercise, which is good that US taxpayers not hemorrhaging more money than it needs to. And it might be a small amount here, but lots of small amounts can mount up to something fairly substantial. We should be pleased about that the US isn't hemorrhaging a lot of money, but you also have to make accountability come to the fore. Otherwise, in one sense, it's a total waste of time, because there's always the risk that these other operations will find another way to be funded and say, well, we won't go through USAID. There'll be some other budget set up somewhere else to finance nefarious operations. And then you're back to the same problem. But so far, interesting. It's a positive dynamic. Let's hope it achieves the objectives we're suggesting, because if it does, it will be a major step in the right direction for the US in dealing with the enormous internal problems that it has, whether it's intelligence agencies or other entities, because the Beltway is very, very poisoned, and that's being polite, in many areas of government and those departments that don't function as part of government, including USAID. Even though it is part, it largely functions independently, which has been a huge problem.
Exactly. And as we'll end it here, as Rubio said earlier today in an interview, they have basically evolved into an agency that believes that they're not even a U.S. government agency. Enough said.
Exactly.
Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.